The ideas in Maseches Eruvin all have to do with geometry and abstract thought, because even though it translates into actual construction projects having to do with a mavoi and a chotzer and things like that, but the ideas require abstract conceptualization of mathematical geometric principles. So anyway, what we're discussing here is that if something is nira mibachutz, v'shava mibifnim. There's a dispute as to how to explain that principle, but the way that it seems that is the easiest way to conceptualize it and to understand it is that if you have a fixture to your mavoi entrance, such as a lechi, but the lechi is only visible on the outside but is not visible on the inside. And the example of that would be is that there's either a protrusion or an indentation to the wall of the mavoi that's only visible from the outside but not from the inside. So the example that's provided is that assuming that when you walk into the mavoi you have two walls that are coming out at you. Now sometimes there are side walls in the Rishus HaRabim, sometimes there are not. But either way, you need to have a lechi that's affixed to the mavoi entrance in order to allow you to carry inside the mavoi. But what if the way that you created the lechi, this recognizable sign, was by creating an indentation on the outer part of the wall, such that this is a recognizable sign that only when you're outside the mavoi you can see. But on the inside of the mavoi, it's flush against the rest of the wall, so you can't see any identifying signs when you're inside the mavoi. So that's the question. The question is that considered to be a valid lechi or not? A lot of this has to do with what the reason why Chazal instituted the lechi recognizability in the first place. Was it for the people outside going in? Was it for the people inside going out? Right? That's the discussion that the Gemara had yesterday and the day before as well. But this is the question of the day, and the Gemara wants to be able to prove it based upon a brisa that we saw yesterday. The brisa that we saw yesterday was the case of a small courtyard that opens into a large courtyard. And when you think about it, you're thinking about two squares, one large square and one small square, looking at it from an aerial view, that are adjacent to each other, where the small square is basically only three sides. The fourth side completely opens up into the larger square. Okay? That's easy to conceptualize, right? So far you're with me, yes?
Yeah.
Now, the brisa says that you're not allowed to carry in the small chotzer, you're only allowed to carry in the large chotzer. What the Gemara is going to be doing now is making an analogy to the rules of chotzer and to the rules of mavoi, even though we've learned before that there are certain differences between them, but for these purposes we're going to make the analogy. The reason why you can't carry in the small chotzer is because even though the small chotzer is 10 by 10 amos, and normally a breach of 10 amos still allows you to carry inside the chotzer. If it's larger than 10 amos, you're not allowed to carry. But the only time that a breach of 10 amos allows you to carry in a chotzer is when at least that wall that has the breach of 10 amos still has some flanks, still has some portion of the wall that remains standing. If the entire side of that courtyard is completely missing, however, then that's not considered to be an acceptable breach, even if it's smaller than 10 amos. Are you with me so far? So far, so good. Mm-hmm. Everyone okay? Yeah. All right? So, the Gemara's question was, if you're going to argue that nira mibachutz v'shava mibifnim is acceptable, that something that's only visible from the outside but is not visible when you're inside is considered to be an acceptable lechi, is considered to be an acceptable recognizable sign, then what about the fact that you have existing flanks outside the wall of the small courtyard? Since the small courtyard opens up into a large courtyard, the small square has flanks, but the flanks flare outwards instead of flaring inwards. They flare outwards to form that side of the wall of the large courtyard that is connected to the small courtyard. So far, so good?
Are you relying on Lavut at that point or not?
No, we're not yet relying on Lavut. This is just straight.
Okay.
The Gemara's question is, do you have flanks on either side of this fourth wall that is completely open? That should be sufficient to enable you to carry, because even though the breach is completely, the entire wall is gone, but at least you have these flanks that should act as a recognizable reminder that there's some wall here.
But we don't say that.
But we don't say that. So the Gemara wants to prove from here that we don't say that if it's only visible from the outside but not visible from the inside, that that's an acceptable lechi. Okay? That was the proof. The Gemara dismisses the proof, because the Gemara then says, maybe we're talking about a case in that brisa where the walls of the small square are protruding into the large square. And the diagram, of course, you have in the Rashi itself, and you have it if you're using an art school Gemara or some other illustrated aid, you have the illustration there in front of you. The walls of the small courtyard are protruding into the large square, and as a result, the flanks that would normally be immediately at right angles to that side of the small courtyard are not connected anymore. They're not connected to the two adjoining walls. Okay, do you see the diagram that Rashi provides you? You got to look at that diagram. A very important diagram. It's very simple, just so you to get an idea. And that's why those flanks don't work. Normally, maybe the flanks do work if they're on the outside but not visible from the inside. But here they don't, because they're not flanks. They're not connected flanks. The Gemara then challenges that premise and says, but what about the principle of Lavut? The principle of Lavut would tell you that even though the walls are protruding inward, but remember, the brisa says that the entire difference in size between the small courtyard and the large courtyard is only 1 amma, is where the square of the small courtyard is 10 by 10, the square of the large courtyard is 11 by 11. Now, what's the principle of Lavut? Anything that's within 3 tfachim is considered to be connected. Now, if you have a small courtyard that's 10, and that is connecting into a courtyard that's 11, then a half an amma on either side are the flanks. That's 3 tfachim. That's Lavut. 3, because a full amma is only 6 tfachim. So divide that difference by half. You got flanks of 3 tfachim, a flank of 3 tfachim on this side, a flank of 3 tfachim on that side. And even if the walls of the small chutzner are protruding into the large chutzner, the principle of Lavut should say, well, they should still be considered to be connected by those flanks because of the principle of Lavut. That's the argument. The Gemara's conclusion to that is, what Ravina says, is that the small courtyard that's protruding into the large courtyard is not centered properly. Mm-hmm. And as a result, you have 2 tfachim of flank on one side, 4 tfachim of flank on the other side, and now you can no longer say Lavut. But wait a minute, says the Gemara. But what about the fact that a lechi only has to be on one side? You don't need a lechi on both sides, and maybe the same holds true by the flanks of a chutzner, the wall of a chutzner, which has a breach of 10 amos. Maybe the flank of a remaining part of a wall only has to be on one side, not on both sides. To that, the Gemara says, we go like Rabbi, and that's where we're up to. And the Gemara says, Rabbi he, the Omar, this is the top of DAF Yud Amud Aleph. This goes according to Rabbi, who says, the Omar bo'inon shnei pasim. Because Rabbi says you need to have 2 flanks, a flank on either side of that breach, in order for that wall to be considered a valid wall. The Tanya, as the Brisa says, Chatzar niteres b'pas echad, Rabbi Omer b'shnei pasim. That there's a machlokus as to whether a courtyard wall with a breach in it needs to have a flank on either side, on both sides, or it only needs a flank on one side. Rabbi says it needs a flank on both sides. So the Gemara now has defended the possibility of us saying that nira mibachutz v'shava mibifnim, that if the lechi marker is only recognizable from the outside, looking from the outside in, but it's not visible for the people that are inside the mavoi, that's still considered to be acceptable, even though this brisa seems to disprove that. we've created a heicha timtza, we've created a limited kind of scenario whereby even though the principle of nir mibachutz v'shava b'mifnim should allow me to carry in the small courtyard, here you can't carry in the small courtyard because you don't have flanks on either side, as Rebbe requires. So the Gemara says, now hold on just a second. Hi, my. Let's be real here. I amart bishlam anir mibachutz v'shava mibifnim eno nidon mishum lechi. The whole brisa will only make sense, says the Gemara, if you paskin that such a lechi that's only recognizable from the outside is not a valid lechi. And here's how we would interpret it. The Rebbe savar la keRebbi Yossi, u'de Rebbe Zera, u'de keRebbi Yossi. Rebbe holds like Rebbe Yossi. Now what does Rebbe Yossi say? Rebbe Yossi says that we're going to see later on that Rebbe Yossi holds that a lechi has to be at least 3 tefachim wide. Now we don't hold like Rebbe Yossi. We hold that a lechi only needs to be 1 tefach wide. But we're going to see later on an opinion of Rebbe Yossi who says that a lechi has to be 3 tefachim wide, and u'de Rebbe Zera. And he also holds of Rebbe Zera. Now what did Rebbe Zera say? Rebbe Zera had said yesterday, "B'nichnasin kos lektana legedola," and he'll say that our brisa is the brisa that you just quoted is where the walls are protruding inward. The small courtyard walls are protruding inward to the large courtyard, and that's why you don't have legitimate flanks unless you use the principle of lavud, right? U'de Ravina lesa, and he doesn't hold like Ravina, and because Ravina is the one who says that it's off center. Okay, so mishum hachi katana be'eser gedola ba'achas esrei mishum de Rebbe savar la keRebbi Yossi. I think the way to read it is the Rebbe savar la keRebbi Yossi u'de Rebbe Zera u'de Ravina lesa, that he doesn't hold of Rebbe Zera and Ravina. In other words, Rebbe holds like Rebbe Yossi that you need to have a lechi that's 3 tefachim wide, and therefore the brisa needs to address the scenario as follows. The reason why you're allowed to carry in the large courtyard is because you need to have flanks that are at least 3 tefachim wide. And so therefore the brisa chose a scenario whereby, looking at it from the perspective of the big courtyard, you have a breach in your wall of 10 amos, but you have flanks on either side of 3 tefachim, and that's why you're allowed to carry in the large courtyard. You cannot carry in the small courtyard because of the principle of nir b'bachutz v'shava mibifnim. We don't, because since the flanks are only visible from the outside of the small courtyard, that's not a reliable lechi to allow you to carry inside the courtyard. Okay? So therefore, then the brisa makes sense. Elai amart nir mibachutz v'shava mibifnim nido mishum lechi u'de Rebbe Zera u'de Ravina isa. But if you tell me that we say that a lechi that's only recognizable from the outside is a valid lechi, then the question is, well, then why can't I carry inside the small courtyard because of Rebbe Zera, who said that the walls of the small courtyard are protruding inwards, and like Ravina said, it's off-center, and therefore I don't have flanks on either side of 3 tefachim, and I don't say lavud. So then, v'Rebbe lo savar la keRebbi Yossi, but then you'd have to say that Rebbe doesn't hold of Rebbe Yossi, because according to Rebbe Yossi, you need to have flanks on either side of 3 tefachim, and here you don't have flanks on either side of 3 tefachim. So you'd have to because even for the large courtyard, if the small courtyard is off center, so then it'll turn out that the flank on one side is less than 3 tefachim. So it can't be that he holds like Rebbe Yossi in order to allow you to carry in the large courtyard. So gedola be'echas esrei lamali mimanavshach I lemishrei legedola ka'asi be'eser shnei tefachim sagya v'i lemisra leketana ka'asi lashminin demiflagi tuva. So the Gemara says, but if you're going to tell me that the whole scenario is the halacha is that we do allow a lechi to be on the outside even when it's not visible on the inside, and we come up with all of these heichatimsas that we've just described for you, so then I don't understand why the brisa specifically chose the dimensions of 10 and 11 amos respectively for the small and large courtyards. Because if the whole purpose of the brisa is to tell me why I'm allowed to carry in the large courtyard, so then be'eser u'shnei tefachim sagir. So then why does the Brisa have to say that the large courtyard is 11 amos by 11 amos? Even if it's only slightly larger than 10 amos, if it's 10 amos and 2 tvachim, then that would be sufficient. Because if your whole principle is to tell me, I have sufficient flankings for the large courtyard on either side, then all I need is a flank of 1 tefach and 1 tefach. I don't need 3 tefachim and 3 tvachim to add it up to 11. All I need is 1 tefach on this side, 1 tefach on that side, that bounds the breach of that small courtyard wall, and then I'm going to be allowed to carry. So the difference in size between the 10 amma by 10 amma versus the large courtyard would only have to be 2 tefachim. So I don't understand why the Brisa chose the example of 10 and 11. Let it choose 10 and 10 and 10 point, 10 amas and 2 tefachim for the large courtyard. And if the whole reason why it chose 10 and 11 was to tell me why I'm not allowed to carry in the small courtyard, so then le'ishme'inun demiflagi tuva. The way Rashi explains, choose dimensions where there's no equivocation. In other words, in a scenario of 10 and 11, then sometimes I will be allowed to carry in the small courtyard when it's not off-center, and sometimes I won't be allowed to carry in the small courtyard when it's off-center, like Ravina had said. But why choose that specific dimension where sometimes yes and sometimes no? Choose a dimension which is across the board not going to be permitted to carry in the small courtyard when, for example, you don't have a lavud situation. Give me an example of 10 and 11.1 or 11.2, where therefore no matter how off-center it is or centered, you won't have lavud and you won't be able to carry. So therefore the Gemara says, Elalav shmamina nira bibachot v'shavim mibifnim eino dinu mishum lechi shmamina. Concludes the Gemara, we can adduce from this brisa that when you have a lechi that's only visible from the outside and not visible from the inside, then that's not considered to be a legitimate lechi and will not allow you to carry. Now this is very complex, what I've just presented to you. It's worthwhile for you to try and chazer it over. But if you caught it, good, and if not, the Gemara basically says it's too much of a contrivance, the way that the Bryce is presented to us, to explain it in the way that you've offered to explain it. Okay? The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Yosef, lo shamiya li hashmaitza. So Rav Yosef now says, I never heard this psak from Rav Huna, who said that nira mibachutz v'shava mibifnim you're allowed to carry. That if it's only visible on the outside, that's a valid. I never heard that. So Amar le Abaya, at amartni halon, ve'aha amartni halon. So Abaya says, Rebbe, you've forgotten some of your teaching because, number one, you taught it to us. You quoted this teaching to us, and you also clarified it. The Amar Rami bar Abba Amar Rav Huna, lechi hamoshech im defano shel mavoi, pachos midalet amos, nidon mishum lechi, u'mishtamish im chudo hapenimi. But dalet amos, nidon mishum mavoi, va'asel lihistamish b'kula. You, Rebbe, had cited for us the following halacha. Let's say you have a mavoi, and you add an extension to the mavoi in such a way, let me give you an illustration, where you've got your classic mavoi. Remember, I told you my face is the dead end of the mavoi, right? Okay, so you decide that you're going to add a lechi, but the way that you add a lechi is that you take a plank, but it's a very thin plank, and you put it right over here. Okay? So it is flush against the inside, the interior of the mavoi wall. The only place where it is recognizable that this is an extension to the mavoi is on the outside, because it's much thinner than the thickness of the regular mavoi wall. Are you with me? So the halacha is as follows. This is a valid lechi, provided that this is not 4 amos in length. Once it becomes 4 amos in length, it's just a mavui extension and it's no longer a lechi. Because a lechi has to be recognizable as an addition to a mavui. But if in itself is the length of a mavui, so then it's not recognizable that it's an addition to a mavui.
It still has to be a tefach wide, right?
It has to be a tefach wide, but it's got to be also less than 4 amos long, extending beyond the mavui. And furthermore, when we say that it is a valid lechi because it's less than 4 amos long, you're not allowed to carry within the airspace of the plank. You can only carry within the airspace of the mavui. So, you came along, Rav Yosef, and you taught us that halacha, and you explained it, and you said, Be'at amart lan Allah shma mina tlas. We learned three things from that halacha. Shma mina bein lecha yayin aser. One is, you clarified from that something that we had discussed in the previous DAF, which is, are you allowed to carry in the airspace of the lechi? And you see from here that you're not allowed to, because we said that you're not allowed to carry within where the lechi is. You're only within from the lechi in the mavui itself. Ushma mina meshach mavui be'arba be'arba. The second thing we learn is that the length of a mavui halachically is defined as 4 amos, which was also the question that was raised previously. Ushma mina nirmi b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim nido mishum lechi. And the third thing that you deduced from that halacha is that if a lechi is only visible from the outside because it's flush on the inside with the rest of the wall, it still is a valid lechi. So the hilchasa, therefore says the Gemara, the final halacha therefore is like Rav Yosef had said, nira mi bachutz v'shava mi mifnim nidon mishum lechi, that it is a valid lechi. So frek the Gemara tiyufta v'hilchasa question mark. But you just refuted, you just showed from the previous brisa with the small and large courtyards that proves that we don't say that it's a valid lechi. So the Gemara says in mishum datani Rabbi Chia kavase. But we also had another brisa yesterday, which Rabbi Chia had taught, which supports the thesis of nir bibachutz v'shava mibifnim as being a valid lechi. And therefore, at best, we have a machlokas tanoim, and we're going to paskin like the Tana who says that it is a valid lechi. We're now going to change gears completely, go back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that if the only time that a mavoi you can carry inside a mavoi is if the aperture of the mavoi, the entrance of the mavoi, is less than 10 amos wide. But if it's more than 10 amos wide, you have to first diminish the size of the aperture before you can put up a lechi. Once the aperture is diminished, then you put up your lechi, and then you're allowed to carry inside the mavoi. Okay? So that was what the Mishnah had said. Omer Rabbi Yatana v'harachav me'eser yemayit, Rabbi Yehuda Omer eino tzarech l'mayit. So in the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even if it's wider than 10 amos, you don't have to diminish the size. It's fine, it's kosher even if it's wider than 10. So now the question is, ve'ad kama. So at what point does even Rabbi Yehuda agree that it's not kosher? So Savar Ravacha Kameda Rav Yosef Lameimar Ad Shloshesrei Ama Ushlish. So one opinion wanted to say that even Rabbi Yehuda has a limit, and that would be 13 1/3 amos. Now where does he get 13 1/3 from? So the Kal V'chomer Mi Pasei Biraos. So the concept of Pasei Biraos is something that we're going to see in the second parak, but let me explain it to you very briefly. The rabbis made an accommodation for travelers on Shabbos. There are wells that one can find scattered throughout certain roads and caravan roads between cities for travelers. And those wells were dug by people who wanted to accommodate travelers. There's only one problem. If you find yourself there on Shabbos, then there's a prohibition of drawing water from a well that's deeper than 10 tfachim, because the water therefore is in a rishus hayachid. How do you get the water out? As soon as you pull the water out of the pit, you've transferred from a rishus hayachid to a rishus harabim. So what accommodation did the rabbis make? They said you can make what's called pasei biraos, which are basically corner flanks, which are in the shape of an L, okay? You make 4 of these, and you bound the 4 corners. You make basically 4 of these around the well, and then you're going to be allowed to consider the area surrounding the well as a rishus hayachid as well. And you'll be able to pull water out of the well and keep it within that squared off area. Okay, that's the heter of pasei biros. That's a big heter. Why is it a big heter? Because you haven't made walls. All you've made is corners. Okay, you made L-shaped corners. Okay, so far so good. So we can make a kal v'chomer as follows. The rabbis, when they made this heter, the question was, how distant can the corners be from each other to be considered this to be a rishus hayachid? And they said, even if there's enough space to allow 8 heads of cattle to pass through in between the corners. So 8 heads of cattle is a total of 13 1/3 amos. We won't go through the math right now, but take my word for it. And that's basically, the Gemara says that if 13 1/3 amos is the limit by pasei biros, it'll be the limit here by a mavli entrance as well. And that's the kal v'chomer that we're going to make. Ma pasi birosh shehitarta bahen poretz meruba al ha'omed lo hitarta ben Yosef mishlosh esrei ama ushlish Moavish lo hitarta bo poretz meruba al ha'omed eno din shelo tatir bo Yosef mishlosh esrei ama ushlish. More makes the following kal v'chomer. There's a special leniency by Pasei Biros that even though normally by a chutzner and a mavoi we require that even though a breach does not invalidate the mavoi, but you still need, there has to be more standing wall than breach, right? Whereas and that's the halacha by a chutzner, which is the same dimensions of these Pasei Biros, as long as the walls, there's more standing wall than breach, then the breach does not invalidate the chutzner. But over here, the rabbis were so lenient, and they said that even if you just have L-shaped corners and the vast majority of the area of this thing is a breach, we're still going to be lenient and consider it to be a reshus hayachid. So make the following kal v'chomer. If the rabbis were lenient by Pasei Biros, where they allow even much more breach than enclosed area, and yet they still limited it to 13 1/3 amos, so surely by the more stringent rules of Mavoi, where we don't allow more breach than standing wall, surely we can't be more lenient than 13 1/3 amos. But the Gemara then says, but wait a minute. V'hi hanosenes. Let's look at it the other way. Pasei birosh she'itarta ben paretz meruba la'omed lo tatir bohen Yosef mishlosh esrei ama ushlish. But mavoi shelo hitarta bo paretz meruba la'omed tatir bo Yosef yud gimel amos ushlish. Maybe I could look at it just the opposite way. Maybe the whole reason why the rabbis limited the distance between each corner to 13 1/3 amos was specifically because they were lenient in another regard. So they had to balance their leniency with the stringency. But whereas by a mavoi, where we don't have the leniency of where we allow even when there's more breach than standing wall, maybe we have the opportunity to be more liberal when it comes to the distance or the width of a breach. So you can't prove one from the other. Maybe the whole reason why the rabbis are stringent by the distance of a breach is specifically because they're more liberal when it comes to meruba omed ala parutz. Okay, so that's the argument, says the Gemara. Inami leidach kisar. Maybe I'll look at it another way. Look at it logically another way. Pasei birosti kalta behu chad kula akal behu kula achrina mavoi klal klal lo. Maybe I could say as follows. Maybe Pasei Biros, the rabbis were completely liberal because they wanted to make special accommodations for travelers. So they created two leniencies. They created a leniency of allowing you just to make corners, and they also made another leniency, which is allowed a breaches that spans as far as 13 1/3 amos. But maybe by a mavoi, they made no accommodations whatsoever. Not only did they not allow you to have more breach than standing wall, but they also didn't allow you to create a span of greater than 10 amos. So how do you see from here that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the maximum is 13 1/3? Maybe it's much less than 13 1/3. Or maybe it's more than 13 1/3. The Gemara says you have no raya one way or the other. Okay, now, based on that Gemara, we're actually going to now switch gears once again, but you see that we're dealing with the whole principle of a 10 amma span is the maximum span according to the Chachamim that you're allowed to have for the entrance of a mavoi. Now we're going to be learning about other kinds of scenarios where you have to diminish the size of the mavoi aperture because it's larger than 10 ammas. So Levi taught the following. Mavoi shuhu rachav esrim amma noetz kana be'emtzi'iso v'dayo. He taught the following brisa. Let's say you have a mavoi where the entrance to the mavoi is at 20 amma span, twice as large as it's allowed to be. So here's what you can do, says the brisa. Take a stick it mamish right in the middle to stand it up, right in the middle of the entrance to the mavoi. So now what you've got is you've divided the mavoi into two entrances instead of one entrance. And he says that's all you need to do, says the brisa. All you need to do is put up that stick, and you're good. So comes along and he says, Hu tani la v'hu amar la dein halacha ka'osa mishnah. He taught that brisa, but then he said we don't paskin like that mishnah. Why? He says because a stick is insufficient. Since you have so much airspace bounding either side of the stick is considered to be null and void. So Ika da Amri Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi En Alacha Ka'osa Mishnah Elahechi Yavid. Some say that Shmuel taught in the name of Levi that we don't paskin like that brisa. But then the question is, so what's the guy supposed to do if he wants to? He's got a 20 amma aperture. How can you diminish it without adding on a 10 amma wall? So the answer is Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi So Shmuel says, in the name of Levi, Osa pas gavo asar b'meshech arba amos, u'ma'amido la'orcho shel mavoi. So here's one remedy. One remedy is if we go back to our example, and you got my face is the dead end of the mavoi, you got the two walls of the mavoi over here, take a board, and instead of a stick that's standing right in the middle, take a board that's at least 10 tefachim high. Actually, it's going to look like this. Thanks, Mark. 10 amos, 10 tefachim high. It has to extend 4 amos long, so that it's considered to be the length of a kosher mavoi. Stick it up here, so that it divides between in the middle of the entrance and divides the mavoi at least 4 amos length into the mavoi, and now you have 2 legitimate less than 10 amma entrances into the mavoi. That's the way to remedy the situation, because now that you have a board that's 10 tefachim high, you can't say it's null and void anymore. This is a legitimate 10 tefachim high board that extends 4 amos as a mavoi into itself, as a mavoi wall, and therefore it has legitimately divided 20 into 2 10s.
It's like 2 mavois now?
It's now like 2 mavois in a sense. At least the entranceway is like 2 mavois, and you'd have to put up a lechi presumably on either side, on either wall. It would seem to me that that's what you'd have to do.
The reason it's buttle sort of is because it's just temporary, that stick, if it was a brick
No,
wall?
not because it's temporary, but because it's insignificant.
What if it was bricks all the way up? In the same space?
It doesn't matter. It could be a metal pole, but if it's just a pole, it's meaningless. It's bounded on all sides by air, so therefore it's considered to be null and void. So the Gemara now says, here's another remedy. Inami kidder Rav Yehuda. You could also remedy it according to Rav Yehuda. Da'ama Rav Yehuda, mavoi shuhu rachav 15 amma. Now his example was a mavoi that's 15 amos wide, but we can easily make the application to 20 amos as you'll do the math yourself. But in any event, marchik shtei amos, va'osa pas shalosh amos. So instead of having to build a 5 amma wall or board, you just have to make a 3 amma wide board and distance it 2 amos away from the wall. And that way, you've created, first of all, you've got your opening that's 10 amos wide, right? So that you've diminished it down to 10. And the remainder is board, a combination of board and open space. And since the majority of it is board, it's considered to be omed merubah ala parutz. It's considered to be more standing area than breach. And therefore, it's considered to be 5 solid amos of wall. And that way, you've avoided having to make a 5 amma wide wall. You've only had to make a 3 amma wide wall.
That's a love it?
Not because of Labat, but because of Omed Meruba ala Paritz. Omed Meruba ala Paritz says that if you have a wall that has a breach in it, the breach can be up to 10 amos as long as there's more standing wall than breach. So here, because you've got more standing 3 amos than the open of 2 amos, you look at that as an isolated portion of wall, and you say that that's considered to be a complete wall. Okay? Remember, Lavat is only less than 3 tefachim. Here we're dealing with mamish, a space of 2 amos. Yeah. Okay? So now the Gemara says, now, since he's talking about 15 amos, the way to easily replicate this for 20 amos is to do this on both sides. He's only talking about doing it on one side. If you do it on both sides, and you've got 5 and 5 and 10 in the middle, then you've easily remedied the situation. So now the Gemara is going to analyze that 15 amos scenario that Rav Yehuda had suggested. Frek the Gemara v'amai yase pas amma umechza v'yarchik shtei amos v'yase pas amma umechza. So the Gemara says, I don't understand why you have to do this. Why don't you just create, instead of creating a plank of 3 amos wide, have just 2 planks that are 1.5 amos wide? You can have 1 plank of 1.5 amos connected directly to the wall, and then have airspace of 2 amos after that, and then put up your second plank of 1.5 amos. And there too, you see that you have omed merubah ala paritz. You've got a total of 3 amos of wall and 2 amos of open space. That should also work. So the Gemara says, Shema mina, the fact that we don't allow for that remedy teaches me that omed merubah ala paritz mishtei ruchos lo havi omed. That because the standing wall space is divided into 2 parts, we can't conjoin them to say that you have more standing wall than breach. In other words, conceptually, the Gemara says that if you have more standing wall than breach, but the breach area is contiguous and the standing wall area is non-contiguous, you cannot conjoin the non-contiguous wall area to say that you have more standing wall than breach. It just doesn't work. So the Gemara says no. La'olam e'melecha hevi omeid v'shayni hacha da'asi avira da'haigisa v'avira da'haigisa u'mavata lei. Really, says the Gemara, you can't prove that from here. Maybe I'll tell you that non-contiguous wall space is conjoinable. But over here, the reason why it's not going to work is that second plank that you put up is positioned in between the 10 amma expanse and on the other side, the 2 ammas on the other side. So you got 2 ammas on one side. You got 10 ammas of open breach on the other side. You got this little tiny 1.5 wide plank in the middle. It's considered to be null and void because it's got so much more airspace on either side. But let's say, instead of having airspace on both sides, let's say I have, for example, I've got 2 1.5 amma planks over here, and they're both attached to walls. And I've got a breach over here. Maybe I could conjoin these two to outnumber the size of the breach, even though these are non-contiguous. So you can't prove that from here. So now the Gemara says, V'yase pas amma, but then let me give you another remedy. Why don't you make a plank that's 1 amma in width, v'yarchik amma, and then have a space of 1 amma, v'yase pas amma v'yarchik amma, then make another plank of 1 amma, position it at 1 amma distance, v'yase pas amma, and then put the third plank of 1 amma. In other words, why do you have to have 3 amma plank, a 3 amma plank that's contiguous? Just have 3 planks of 1 amma each and position them over the span of 5 ammas. So there the Gemara says you don't have that previous concern that it's flanked on both sides by airspace that's larger than it. Shma mina omed keparetz aser. What we can deduce from here is that if you have exactly the same amount of, assuming that non-contiguous planks are not conjoinable, you see from here that if the airspace is exactly equal to the breach, then the breach is exactly equal in width to the wall, then the wall does not outnumber the breach. The wall only outnumbers the breach if it's larger than the breach, but if it's actually equal in distance, then it doesn't outnumber the breach. So the Gemara says no. La'olamei melacha mutter. V'shayni hacha da'asa avira da'haigisa u'da'haigisa u'mevatalei. Here too the Gemara gives the same answer. Maybe in reality, when you have 3 planks that are of equal width to the 2 breaches in between the 3 planks, then that is valid. But over here you have the additional disability of the fact that on the other side of one of the planks, the outermost plank, you have that 10 amma breach. And that's what invalidates that 1 amma plank. So the Gemara now says, fine, let me ask you another remedy. V'yarchik amma v'yase pas amma umechza, v'yarchik amma v'yase pas amma umechza. But here's another remedy. Here what you can do is take 2 planks that are 1.5 ammas each, and position the 1 plank 1 amma away from the wall, and then position the second plank at 1 amma distance from there. In other words, there what you'll have is you'll have more plank than any airspace in between the 2. And then that should work, says the Gemara. You still have a solution without having to have a contiguous 3 amma plank. The Gemara says, "Inachinami v'kulei lo atruchei rabbanan." You're right, that would work, but because that creates a more significant feat of engineering, because you have to have 2 freestanding planks of 1.5 ammas, the Chachamim didn't want to be matriach you. But the reality is that would also work.
What about that extra? Right. We just argued beforehand. You fill that 10 out on the other side.
Well, the answer is because here you have 1.5 amma of plank, and on the other side it's only an airspace of 1 amma. So there, the Gemara wants to argue that there you have an advantage, is that you don't have airspace on either side that outnumbers the plank. You only have airspace on one side. That's going to outnumber it. So now the Gemara says, but then I have another concern, says the Gemara. What about the fact that if you diminish the wall in the way that you've just described it, by putting up your 3 amma plank at a distance of 2 ammas away from the wall, people may walk into that 2 amma expanse. And because that 2 amma expanse does not have its own lechi, then you have a problem where people are walking into the mavoi in an area, in a doorway, in an aperture, which does not have a lechi. Because the lechi was only put up on the 10 amma expanse, and here there's a 2 amma expanse on the side as well. So Amar Avada Bar Masna Chazaka Inada Meniach Pesach Gadol Benichnas Bepesach Katan. The Gemara says because we have a chazaka that if a person has the ability to walk through a large doorway and a small doorway, he'll always choose the large doorway. So therefore, we don't have to worry that people are going to use the small doorway. But then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, don't you remember we had a Maisa a blot ago, where we talked about if there's a breach on the side of the mavoi, on one of the mavoi walls, that's within a few tfachim of the entrance to the mavoi, it invalidates the entire mavoi because people will walk into that and will walk into the doorway with the lechi. So why did we say there that it invalidates the mavoi, where over here it doesn't invalidate the mavoi? Hasam kamimait behilucha hochalo kamimait behilucha. Answers the Gemara because in that scenario, that's a shortcut. That breach in the side of the mavoi wall will be a shortcut for people coming from that direction. But over here, since the small aperture of 2 amos is in the same direction, the same direction where the large breach is, it doesn't create a shortcut for anybody, and therefore we don't have to worry about people using it. We're going to conclude with just the beginning of the next sugya because we're running out of time. Tanan Hasam. We have a mission that says, Or ha'asla v'chalal shalom mitzarfen b'tefach. Now here we're talking about toilet seat covers. Now really, in those days, if you were an aristocrat, you sat on a toilet. If you weren't an aristocrat, you just squatted. But there was a pit that you would defecate into, and if you were wealthy, you had a toilet seat. And that toilet seat was made out of leather. So the point of this mission is to talk about the tumah of an ohel, because a piece of leather that is situated horizontally will create an ohel for anything that's underneath it. If, let's say, you have a piece of corpse that's in your toilet pit, right, in your whatever that thing is called, in your toilet pit, right, and you have this leather piece that's covering it, it'll form an ohel such that everything that's underneath that leather thing will become tameh, because it's created a tumas ohel over it. But the question is, what if the leather piece has a slit in it for you to sit on as a toilet? So at what point does the leather slit make this no longer an ohel? Because there's more open space than there is covering. So the Mishnah says, Or ha'asla v'chalal shelo mitzarfen b'tefach. Both the slitted area and the leather area of this leather toilet seat will be mitzaref, will be conjoinable to create an ohel of 1 tefach by 1 tefach, because that's the minimum dimensions of an ohel. So my or ha'asla, what is this or ha'asla, this leather toilet? Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, or kisui shel beis hakisei. It's the leather cover, it's the leather seat of a toilet. So the kama, and what are the dimensions of the leather cover together with its slit? And this is the discussion that we're going to continue with tomorrow. We'll talk about toilets. Have a wonderful day.